He told his cousin I was the safest bet he'd ever made. Not because he loved me. Because I had a 401n, a paid-off car, and nowhere urgent to be. I didn't hear it directly. I heard it through the wall of our guest bathroom at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, while I was standing there in my socks holding a glass of water I'd come downstairs to get. The kitchen light was off. I hadn't turned it on. I don't know why. Maybe I was tired. Maybe something in me already knew to stay quiet. Philip was in the living room. The TV was low. His cousin Kendrick was visiting from Atlanta. Just passing through, he'd said, needed a couch for 2 nights. I'd made up the pullout, washed the guest sheets, left a fresh towel on the arm of the sofa. That's the kind of woman I was. The kind who washed sheets for a man she'd only met twice and didn't particularly like either time. I was about to walk in and say goodnight when I heard my name. Not my full name, just Renee. The way Philip said it when he wasn't talking to me, flat, like a label. I stopped.
Renee's not going anywhere, he said. She's 37. She owns a condo. She's already halfway into this lined up.
There was a pause. I heard Kendrick laughed. Low, like he was trying to keep it quiet. She know that's how you feel. She knows what she needs to know, Philip said. Look, I'm not saying I don't care about her. I'm just saying it's practical. The timing works. She's stable. I'm not about to walk away from stable. I stood in the dark for a long time after that. I didn't drop the glass. I didn't cry. I just stood there and let it settle over me like cold water, and I thought about how I had spent the last 2 years rearranging my life for a man who had been calculating the whole time. I met Philip 18 months before that night. A mutual friend introduced us at a birthday dinner for someone I barely knew, one of those situations where you go because you said you would, and you spend the whole night glad you did. He was sitting at the far end of the table. He laughed loud. He had good manners with the waitstaff. He asked me what I did and actually listened when I told him. I'm a compliance officer. I work in financial services. It is not a glamorous job, Sid Sirius is. It is not a glamorous job, and most people's eyes glaze over inside of 30 seconds. Philip asked me a follow-up question. That alone set him apart from most of the men I dated in the previous 5 years. We exchanged numbers. He texted the next morning, not at midnight, not 3 days later, the next morning before 9. That should have told me something about how deliberate he was. I read it as attentiveness. I understand now that those are not always the same thing. We dated for 7 months before I introduced him to my mother. Her name is Helen, and she does not mince words. She pulled me aside after dinner and said, "He's charming, Renee, but charm is a tool. Make sure he has something underneath it." I told her she was being ungenerous. I told her she always did this. I drove home annoyed and called my best friend Janelle from the parking lot of my mother's building to complain. Janelle said, "Your mom's not wrong, though." I told Janelle she wasn't helpful. 8 months after that, Philip asked me to move in with him. His lease was ending. I still owned my condo. He suggested we move into his new place together, split the rent, save money, see how we did sharing space before taking anything further. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like a grown-up decision. I talked myself into it over 2 weeks, and a lot of the right things about the future. Where he said all the right things about the future. I rented out my condo. The rental income covered most of my share of what I was now contributing to his household. I kept my accounts separate. That much I had the sense to do, but I was covering groceries most weeks, utilities half the time, and I'd fronted 2 months of rent when he said he was between paychecks. He always paid me back. Mostly. Enough that I didn't make a thing of it. What I didn't see, standing in that kitchen hallway in my socks, was how clearly he had seen all of it. The condo, the income, the stability. The woman who washed sheets for people she didn't like because it was the right thing to do. He had looked at all of that and made a decision about me that had nothing to do with love. I went back upstairs that night. I set the water glass on my nightstand and lay down next to Philip when he came to bed 20 minutes later. He put his hand on my shoulder the way he always did. I didn't move away. I didn't say anything. I stared at the ceiling, and I thought very clearly, the way I think at work when something doesn't add up, and I need to trace it back to its source. I'm not going to do anything tonight, I told myself. I'm going to think first. I've always been better when I think first. In the morning, Philip got up at 6:30 and went for his run. I waited until I heard the front door close. Then I got up and I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee, and I started going back through things. Not dramatically, not tearing the house apart, just looking. I pulled up our shared household expense spreadsheet, the one we'd set up together so we could track contributions. I'd built it. Of course I'd built it. I went through the last 14 months line by line. The pattern was obvious once I was looking for it. My contributions ran about 60% most months. The 2 months I'd fronted rent were documented. The partial repayments were there too. But the full picture, laid flat, was a woman who had been quietly carrying more than half of a life she thought she was building equally with someone else. I closed the laptop. I drank my coffee. Kendrick was still asleep on the pullout. I could hear him from the hallway. I thought about calling Janelle, but it was early. I thought about calling my mother, but I wasn't ready to hear her be right. I sat with it alone for a while, which is something I've learned to do. Sit with things before I act on them. Over the next 2 weeks, I did not change anything on the surface. I still made dinner on the nights it was my turn. I still kissed Philip when he came home. I answered his texts. I went to his co-worker's birthday thing on a Friday night and made pleasant conversation with people I'd never see again. I was good at that. I had been good at it for a long time. But underneath all of that, I was working. I called my property manager and had a conversation about the timeline for my tenant's lease. I had a meeting with my financial advisor, a woman named Sandra, who I'd worked with for 4 years and trusted completely. I didn't tell Sandra everything, but I told her enough. I said I was thinking about making some changes and I wanted to understand exactly where I stood. We went through everything. The condo.
The 401(n). The investment account I'd opened 3 years before. A small savings account Philip didn't know about because I had never mentioned it, and he had never asked, which told you something about how interested he actually was in my inner life versus my balance sheet.
Sandra said, "You're in a solid position, Renee. Whatever you're thinking about doing, you have options." Options. There's a word. I also called my cousin Dwayne, who is a real estate attorney in Charlotte. I didn't explain everything, but I said I was evaluating a situation and I wanted to understand what my exposure looked like as a tenant in a lease I've co-signed. He walked me through it. It wasn't as complicated as I'd feared. The lease was in both our names. I had the right to give proper notice. I had not signed anything that tied my financial future to Philip's beyond that lease. That was important. That was the part I needed to be sure about. The moment I knew I was done. Truly done. Not just hurt and considering. Came on a Thursday afternoon, 12 days after the night with the water glass. I had come home early from work. There was a migraine threatening. The kind that starts behind one eye and takes over everything if I don't catch it fast. I took my medication and lay down in the bedroom with the curtains closed. Philip didn't know I was home. He came in around 5:30. I heard him on his phone in the kitchen. The migraine had backed off enough that I was half awake, lying there in the dark, and his voice carried. He wasn't talking to Kendrick this time. I didn't recognize the voice on the other end, but I could hear Philip's side clearly. "No, she's not a problem. Renee's easy. You know the type. She wants it to work, so she makes it work. I'm not worried about her." He laughed at something the other person said. Yeah, Look, just tell me the number. I need to know what we're looking at before I commit to anything. I lay there in the dark with the curtains closed, and I listened to him discuss something I didn't fully understand. A number, a timeline. Someone named Fletcher who apparently owed him something. And I thought, I am not easy. I have never been easy. I have been kind, and I have been generous, and I have been patient, and that man has been mistaking all three of those things for weakness his entire time with me. I got up. I went to the bathroom. I washed my face. I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment. Then I went downstairs and said, "Hey, didn't hear you come in," and made myself a cup of tea while he finished his call, and I smiled at him when he came into the kitchen, and he had no idea. He had absolutely no idea. I gave myself one more wavering. Not because I wanted to do this right. I wanted every piece in place before I said a single word. Because I knew once I said the words, there would be no recovering the ground. I reached out to my property manager and confirmed that my tenant would be open to ending the rental agreement early if I needed to move back in. She said she'd have a conversation. 2 days later, she came back and said yes. My tenant was actually planning to relocate for a job and had been wondering how to bring it up. The timing was almost too clean. I called my sister Marlene in Baltimore. Marlene is 3 years older than me and has never liked Philip. She'd said so exactly once, calmly, over the phone, and when I pushed back she dropped it, but I knew she hadn't changed her mind. I told her what I'd heard, both conversations. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you need from me?" That's Marlene. That's always been Marlene. I told her I needed someone to know. Just someone to know before I did anything. She said, "I know." "What else?" I said I might need help moving. She said she'd take the weekend off. The dinner where it happened was not something I planned. I want to be clear about that. I had planned to have a private conversation. I had planned to wait until a quiet evening at home, sit down across from Philip, and tell him clearly and without drama that I knew what kind of man he was, and that I was leaving, and that I needed him to cooperate with ending the lease so we could both move on cleanly. That was my plan. What I did not plan was his mother's birthday dinner. Patricia called me 2 weeks before all of this and asked if I would help her organize a dinner for her 65th birthday. She wanted it at the Italian restaurant where she and her late husband had gone on their first date. She wanted her family there. She asked me personally because, she said, I was family now. She said, "You're the one who gets things done, Renee. You always know how to make things nice." I had already been thinking about leaving when she asked me, but I told her yes, because I liked Patricia, and because her birthday had nothing to do with what her son had done, and because I am the kind of woman who follows through on what she's committed to. So I organized the dinner. I made the reservation for 14 people. I ordered the cake she'd described, lemon with vanilla buttercream, from a bakery she'd mentioned once, 6 months ago, that I had written down because that is also the kind of woman I am. The night of the dinner, I was sitting at the far end of the table from Philip. His Aunt Constance was next to me, his sister Paulette was across. Patricia was at the head of the table, laughing, having the night she'd wanted. The food was good. The wine was good. Everything was fine. And then I heard Philip, halfway down the table, explaining to his Uncle Gerald something about an investment he was involved in, something about a property deal, something about a partner, and I heard him say my name. Not to me. He didn't look at me. He said it to Gerald. Renee's backing part of it. She's solid. She understands how these things work, being in finance. Gerald nodded. He looked impressed. I had not agreed to back any investment. I had not had that conversation. I had not been asked, which meant I was being used as a reference, or worse, as a name for something I knew nothing about. I set down my fork. I picked up my wine glass. I waited for a natural pause in the conversation. maybe 30 seconds, maybe less, and then, from my end of the table, I said, clearly enough that the people near me could hear, "Philip, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure Gerald understands that I haven't agreed to anything. I'm not backing any investment. I don't know what you're referring to." The table got very quiet. Philip looked at me. His expression went through several things very quickly. "I was just explaining." "I know what you were explaining," I said, "and I want to be accurate. I haven't committed to anything, just so that's clear." I picked up my fork again. I turned back to Constance and asked her how her daughter's school year was going. The table slowly resumed its noise. Paulette was staring at me. Patricia was watching me from the other end of the table with an expression I couldn't quite read. Philip did not speak for the rest of the dinner unless someone spoke to him first. After the cake and the candles and the photographs, when people were getting their coats, Philip pulled me into the hallway outside the restaurant. "What was that?" he said. His voice was low, tight. "It was accurate," I said. "You humiliated me." "I corrected a misstatement," I said, "in front of your family, which is where you made it." He stared at me. "This is not the place. You're right. That's not. We can talk at home." We drove back separately. He drove. I took an Uber. I needed the 20 minutes. When I got home, I sat on the couch and I told him everything. Not loudly. Not crying. I told him what I'd heard through the wall the night Kendrick was visiting. I told him what I'd heard from the bedroom when he thought I was at work. I told him about the spreadsheet and the 14 months and the pattern I'd seen laid out in plain numbers. I told him that I was not easy. I told him that I was not a safe bet. I told him that I was a person and that I had been generous with him because I wanted to be, not because I had nowhere better to go. He tried several things. He said I had misunderstood. He said I was taking things out of context. He said he'd been stressed about money, and sometimes he talked in ways he didn't mean. He said he loved me. He said it with real feeling, or something that performed like real feeling, and I sat there and I watched him do it, and I thought about how many times I had believed that and adjusted myself around it.
I said, "I'm moving back to my condo at the end of the month. My tenant is leaving, and the timing works out.
I'll help cover the last month here, because my name is on the lease, and that's the right thing to do. After that, we're done." He went quiet. "That's it," he said. "That," I said. He slept in the guest room. I'm not sure either of us slept much. The last week in that apartment, I packed in the mornings while he was at work. Not frantically. Methodically, the way I do most things, box by box. I was surprised, honestly, by how little of what was in that apartment was actually mine. I had slid into his life so carefully, so considerately, that I had barely left a mark on the physical space. My books, my clothes, a set of pots I'd bought because his were cheap and warped. A print I'd hung in the hallway because the wall had been bare and bare walls made me uncomfortable. I took the print down and the wall was bare again, and I felt something about that. Not sadness, exactly. More like recognition. Marlene came on Saturday with her truck and her friend Opal, who did not ask questions and carried boxes like she'd been doing it her whole life. We had the car loaded in under 3 hours. Marlene handed me a coffee from the place down the street. We stood on the sidewalk for a minute before I got in. "You okay?" she said. "I'm fine," I said. "I'm actually fine." She looked at me for a moment, deciding whether to believe me. Then she nodded. We drove back to my condo. My tenant had left it clean. There was a small note on the kitchen counter that said, "Good luck. Take care of this place. It's a good one." I stood in the middle of the living room that was mine, in the apartment that was mine, surrounded by boxes, and I let myself feel the full weight of the last 2 years, not with regret. That's not what I mean. With clarity. Finally, with clarity. 3 weeks after I moved back, I filed paperwork to form an LLC. I'd been thinking about it for a while. a consulting practice, small on the side, using the expertise I'd spent 15 years building. I'd put it off because there was always something, always a reason it wasn't the right moment. There was no reason now to keep waiting. I called the entity Clearview Compliance Solutions. I named it myself, in my own kitchen, at my own table, with a cup of coffee I'd made in my own coffee maker in my own time. Sandra helped me set up a dedicated business account. Janelle, who had started her own business 4 years ago, sat on the phone with me for 2 hours and walked me through everything she wished someone had told her. My mother, when I finally told her the whole story, was quiet for a long moment and then said, "I want you to be okay, Renee. Are you okay?" I said. "I am. I really am." She said, "Good. Then I'll save the rest of what I have to say." I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed easily in months. I think about that night sometimes. Standing in the dark with the water glass, the TV low in the other room, hearing myself described like a line item in a ledger, I think about how I didn't drop the glass. How I went back upstairs and lay down and thought clearly. I am not easy. I was never easy. What I was trusting. And generous, and willing to invest in something I believed in. Those are not flaws. I've decided those are not flaws. The flaw was in a man who looked at those qualities and saw an opportunity instead of a person. I know the difference now between someone who sees your stability and wants to build beside it, and someone who sees your stability and wants to lean on it while they look for somewhere better to go. I know the difference between being chosen and being used. It took me 2 years and 1 conversation through a wall to learn it. I don't need anyone to tell me I'm going to be okay. I already am.